So if you have been living under a rock, there's two wars going on in the world. Well, more than two wars, but two wars that are now getting intertwined. There's the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and there is a civil war in Sudan. And calling it a civil war, some people object to that because it's not really like the people haven't really chosen a side. It's two factions, the RSF and the armed forces, which joined together to overthrow a civilian government, who are now fighting for power, right? So it's two people who want to rule their own dictatorship fighting for power. There's no like democratic side on this. It's two groups of thugs, to be blunt, who are fighting each other. There's these two wars, which you wouldn't really think are that intertwined, but they're intertwined through one element, and that is Russia. Russia has the Wagner Group, which is a mercenary organization that has been engaged in overseas activities for the Russian government through shell companies for the better part of a decade now, whether that be in the Central African Republic, whether that be in Libya, whether that be in Mali, probably soon to be in Niger, and also Sudan, specifically in a relationship with the Rapid Support Forces. Recently, this has been shown through them shipping tons and tons and tons of weapons to the RSF. We talked about this on the channel before, about photographs that were unveiled that showed Russian planes carrying equipment to Libya to then be brought over the border, but that wasn't a definite piece of evidence. Since then, there's been more and more and more evidence that has come out that it makes it all but certain that the Wagner Group is supplying the Rapid Support Forces led by Hekmeti, a brutal warlord whose forces have engaged in many atrocities and were actively involved in slaughtering people in the south of Sudan, in southern Sudan, during the war with South Sudan and the rebels there. He is getting shipped weapons across the border from Chad. There was photographs recently published. I don't know if it was published by CNN, but there were photographs published of over 100 trucks crossing the borders, loaded with ammunition, loaded with shoulder-mounted munitions that can shoot planes out of the sky, which will be extremely useful for the RSF since they're trying to combat the armed forces, Air Force, which is their main advantage over the RSF. There's other shipments that have been made, but that's the big one that I just want to use as an example. So the Russians are supporting the RSF because they want access to the gold mines in Sudan, which they get a very big piece of and get to manage as long as they continue to prop up the RSF and continue their security arrangement. And by using that gold, they can use it to avoid sanctions, and of course, gold is profitable. I don't think I need to explain the usefulness of gold, but importantly, it can be used to avoid sanctions that have been placed on Russia because of their invasion of Ukraine. So, where does Ukraine come into this? Well, apparently, Ukraine, according to sources within Ukrainian intelligence, Ukrainian military sources, are coming out and saying that they are engaging in special operations in Sudan, and we've had some footage come out that seems to show somewhat Ukrainian influenced drone operations taking part in Sudan. There were a few strikes, I believe 8 strikes, or there were 8 drones that participated in strikes across Sudan. It was specifically in the, one second, let me try to put it, the Omdurman area. This is to the south of the capital. Most of the population is concentrated in the capital of Khartoum, but there's other areas outside of that also is being fought over. And in this area, which is south of the capital, there are multiple drone strikes that were in a style that if you guys have seen the war in Ukraine, which would be familiar to you. Here is an example of one of them. That is a suicide drone swooping down in the style that the swoop down in Ukraine, which is a tactic that isn't really known in this part of the world. It hasn't really been used in Sudan before. Suicide drones swooping down and hitting targets like this. This isn't something that this part of the world is familiar with. There have been drones used in Ethiopia. There's been drones, I believe, used in Egypt, but they were drones dropping grenades, not suicide drones. It also seems to be using a type of commercially available drone that is also heavily used by the Ukrainians. Also, in the footage that I went through, I saw Ukrainian text on the controller of the drone. Now, is that an open and shut case all around that proves it? No. I guess they could have just gotten their hands on a Ukrainian controller. The drone is commercially available. They could have gotten it through other means. And while this tactic has not been wildly used in Sudan or this part of the region before, it could start being used because the internet exists. They start seeing it online. But there's just too many coincidences, and sources are saying that they are getting involved. And this is all also on top of the fact that this wouldn't even be the first time that we've heard rumblings of Ukraine going out of their way to attack Russian assets overseas outside of Ukraine, expanding the war to Russia's other holdings across the globe. There were rumors, and this was part of the Jack Textera leaks, that was with that when that American National Guardsman leaked a bunch of stuff on Discord to impress a bunch of people who didn't care and ruined his life for no reason. Anyway, a part of those leaks included information that the Ukrainians were talking about a bunch of different operations, which included, crossing the border into Russia. There were talks about certain secret operations, but one of the operation that were, I think, most telling or most interesting to me was plans to attack Russian soldiers in Syria working with the FSA. That's the Free Syrian Army, or whatever the remnants of the FSA, mostly backed by the Turkish government at this point, or propped up by the Turkish government at this point in large part. Not saying it doesn't have support on the ground. It most certainly does. If you talk to Syrians abroad or Syrians in the area, there's certainly still a lot of support for the crumbling of the Assad regime. But the revolution is not what it used to be. The plan was for the Ukrainian government to use resources in Syria to attack Russian assets, kill Russian professional soldiers in the area, to strain their resources, either so the Russians have to pull back resources from Ukraine, deploy them in Syria to keep up their holdings, or just kill Russian soldiers that could later be used in Ukraine against the Ukrainians. Causing more security crises for the Russians at other locations causes them to divert resources elsewhere, or they risk losing all of their influence around the globe because they're falling on a sword in Ukraine. And so since we already have a record that we know that Ukraine was planning attacks on Russian forces and countries across the world before, also Syria, so it could be Wagner forces as well, so there's a direct connection here. We have controllers with Ukrainian markings on it, tactics that are distinctly from the war in Ukraine and are not familiar in the region, and as well as sources coming out and saying, yes, the Ukrainian government is doing this. Now, the Ukrainian government has not come out and affirmed that this is going on. The Sudanese military, which would be getting the which would be the beneficiary of this help, has denied that this is happening. And when American government officials had this information brought to them by reporters, they seemingly were just surprised. I don't know if the surprise was genuine or if it was not genuine, but they seemed to be surprised by it. Now, some people would roll their eyes at the notion that the American government, which knew that the invasion was going to happen before it even happened, somehow doesn't have this information. But we know from the leaks and from other government statements and from just the grapevine that the American government has said in the past that they know more about the Russians than they do about the Ukrainians, because they've got more intelligence assets in Russia than they do in Ukraine, and Ukrainians are pretty tight-lipped out of fear of leaks like the Jack Textera leak. So the idea that the American government wouldn't know about this isn't that crazy, even though they did know about this plan for another operation in Syria before. Either way, this shows that the Ukrainians, in my opinion, are getting ready for the long haul. If this is true, and the evidence, the overwhelming evidence, seems to point towards this being true. If this is true, then this means that the Ukrainians are trying to expand the war. They're trying to expand the war outside of Ukraine, which they had already done by bombing locations in Russia. Shooting back is a thing that they can do. They obviously have the right to shoot back, but this is different. They're taking their operations to countries that are not even direct parties to the war in Ukraine. They're trying to stretch Russia's line thin elsewhere and add pressure to them at other locations, basically showing that they will be a thorn in Russia's side everywhere. They're letting the Russians know this is going to be a long war. It's going to be an expensive war. And the war is not constrained to Ukraine's borders. The war is against Russia wherever Russian assets may be. And the thing is, Russia can't have air defense everywhere. Russia can't have soldiers on high alert everywhere all at the same time. Russia can't have their allies' forces or the forces that they're propping up, like the RSF. This, I would say, basically genocidal militia. They can't have them protected by Russian air defense at all times, as we're seeing here. This is another clip of one of the drone strikes that were supposedly assisted by the Ukrainian government, by Ukrainian special forces, on an RSF truck, as you can see them limping away.
Kyle Parker has donated $20. But Dylan, have you considered that America bad?
You know what? I was just thinking that there was something I was forgetting here in the big equation about how this is going to affect the war. And thank you for reminding me of what truly matters. It is true that America do be bad. America do be bad. America be bad. Anyway, this is a pretty, I would say that when people talk about escalation or the word escalation, right? I think people use the word very quickly in a bunch of situations where it doesn't really apply, right? It's hard to escalate past the full-scale war that Russia already launched. But this is something that if you can't at least use the word escalation, you can use the word expansion. This is certainly, if true, an expansion of the war, showing that the Ukrainians will take the war to the Russians wherever they are.